December 29th, 1944, 23:40 hours. Major Carroll Smith sits inside his P-61 cockpit at McGuire Field on Mindoro, his radar operator locked onto something streaking through pitch-black Philippine skies at 180 knots. 26 years breathing, 43 missions logged, 4 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. 12 Japanese bombers inbound tonight, hell-bent on obliterating American runways below. Smith understood their playbook perfectly. Japanese strike aircraft had hammered Mindoro relentlessly for 14 consecutive nights. 334 air raid sirens in 2 weeks straight. American construction battalions were frantically completing twin airfields critical for the upcoming Lingayen Gulf amphibious assault. Japanese high command recognized those airstrips represented existential danger. Operational American fighters launching from Mindoro could blanket the entire invasion fleet with protective cover. Japan had to eliminate those runways. They dispatched waves of bombers nightly, conventional attack aircraft, suicide planes, anything capable of delivering ordnance. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron touched down at Mindoro, December 26, 72 hours ago. Smith's unit stood as the sole defensive barrier between incoming bombers and 20,000 sleeping American soldiers in canvas shelters beneath their flight path. The weight felt crushing. Every hostile aircraft penetrating their defense meant construction workers blown apart, delayed runway completion, postponed invasion, multiplied casualties at Lingayen. Smith's Black Widow represented something Imperial Japan had never confronted in darkness. Northrop designed the P-61 as America's first purpose-built nocturnal combat aircraft. 66-foot wingspan stretched between twin booms, dual Pratt Whitney R2800 engines generating 2,000 horsepower apiece. Maximum velocity 366 miles per hour. Yet the true killing instrument wasn't the quartet of belly-mounted 20mm Hispano cannons. It was the SCR-720 radar array protruding from the nose cone. This radar system detected airborne targets 5 miles distant in absolute blackness. The Japanese believed night made them invisible. Radar made that faith lethal. Their bombers operated nocturnally, assuming darkness granted immunity. Catastrophically wrong. The radar operator occupied a separate compartment aft of Smith, monitoring a phosphorescent scope displaying every aircraft within detection range. Lieutenant Philip Porter handled Smith's radar duties. 6 months tracking aerial contacts. Porter mastered scope interpretation, vectoring Smith toward targets, distinguishing Allied planes from enemy formations. Tonight's equation was brutal. 1 P-61 versus 12 Japanese bombers. Engaging one target allowed 11 others to slip through unopposed toward their objective. The arithmetic was merciless. Even destroying 3 or 4 aircraft meant the remainder accomplished their bombing mission. American blood would soak Mindoro soil. Airfield damage would accumulate. Invasion timetables would slide backward. Smith trained 18 months for exactly this scenario. Night fighter qualification at Orlando Army Airfield, Florida. Radar intercept protocols, lightless navigation, firing practice in total darkness. Training was exhaustive because nocturnal aerial combat represented aviation's most lethal specialty. 0 visual reference points, no horizon line, only instruments and radar returns, and desperate hope your target wasn't friendly. The 418th flew its inaugural combat sortie November 1943, operating from crude New Guinea strips, initially flying P-70 Havoc aircraft, later experimental radar-equipped P-38 Lightnings. Black Widows arrived September 1944. The P-61 delivered everything earlier night fighters lacked: stability, forgiving handling, raw power. The radar actually functioned reliably. But radar couldn't solve Smith's dilemma tonight. 12 bombers approaching. Fuel sufficient for perhaps 3 hours aloft. 10 minutes per interception meant only 3 bombers intercepted before mandatory return to base. 9 bombers breaking through. 9 bombers equaled hundreds dead, potentially thousands if they struck fuel storage or ammunition dumps. Want to discover how Smith stalked 4 Japanese bombers through absolute darkness? Smash that like button. It propels these forgotten stories to more viewers. Subscribe if you haven't. Back to Smith's impossible mission. Porter's voice crackled through the intercom at 23:42 hours. 4 distinct radar contacts on his scope, all tracking southbound toward Mindoro, separated by altitude. Smith faced an immediate decision: which bomber to pursue first, and whether his plan to intercept all 4 was tactical genius or suicide. Smith advanced both throttles forward. The twin R-2800s responded without hesitation. The Black Widow climbed 2,000 feet every 60 seconds. Porter transmitted vectors continuously. Heading 035, altitude 8,000, range 4 miles. Smith saw nothing beyond his canopy except void. No lunar illumination, no stars visible, dense cloud cover obscuring everything. This explained Japanese selection of tonight. Complete obscurity meant their bombers operated invisibly against conventional interceptors. But Smith wasn't flying anything conventional. The SCR-720 radar employed a rotating parabolic antenna dish installed in the nose section. That dish transmitted microwave pulses forward through 180 degrees. When pulses struck an aircraft, they reflected backward. The radar operator's scope rendered the return as a glowing blip. Porter's scope featured dual displays, one showing azimuth left or right of the aircraft's center line, another showing elevation above or below. Porter monitored both simultaneously, guiding Smith toward contacts using verbal corrections. Left 5 degrees, down 3. The system worked flawlessly because Porter excelled at his specialty. Range 3 miles. Smith activated his pilot's radar scope, a smaller display integrated into the primary instrument panel. When targets closed sufficiently, Smith could track independently. The pilot's scope was simpler than Porter's. Single display showing range and relative bearing, but adequate. Once Smith acquired the target on his scope, he could close for the kill without relying on Porter's instructions. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M, nicknamed Betty by Americans. Twin 1,400 horsepower Mitsubishi Kasi engines. Top speed 270 miles per hour. 7-man crew. Bomb capacity 1,760 pounds. The Betty possessed one fatal vulnerability. Fuel tanks lacked self-sealing capability. A single cannon burst would transform the bomber into an airborne torch. Range 2 miles. Smith could observe the target on his scope now, the blip holding steady. The bomber crew remained completely unaware Smith trailed behind them. Japanese bombers carried no tail warning radar. No method existed to detect a pursuing night interceptor. They flew through darkness, believing themselves secure. The P-61 made that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards, still unable to acquire visual contact with the Betty. Darkness remained absolute. He depended entirely on the radar scope. The blip enlarged as range decreased. 800 yards. 700. 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally spotted it, a dark silhouette against marginally lighter clouds. The bomber's engine exhaust glowed faintly, dim orange halos from the nacelles. Smith maneuvered the P-61 into firing position slightly below the bomber, slightly aft. The 420mm Hispano M2 cannons were fixed forward in the lower fuselage. Smith aimed the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel, which projected an illuminated reticle onto combining glass. Smith adjusted position until the bomber centered perfectly in the reticle. Range 400 yards. Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon held 200 rounds, 800 total, sufficient for approximately 40 seconds sustained fire. Smith wouldn't require 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine prescribed short, concentrated bursts, close distance, fire, confirmed destruction, advance to next target. Wasting ammunition on one bomber meant fewer rounds for remaining targets. Smith squeezed the trigger at 350 yards. All 4 cannons fired simultaneously. The sound was thunderous despite engine noise. 20-millimeter high-explosive shells streaked toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. Tracers appeared as red lines slicing through blackness. Smith fired for 2 seconds, 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's starboard wing detonated. Fuel ignited instantaneously. The bomber rolled hard right and plunged into a vertical dive. Smith watched it tumble. The burning aircraft illuminated cloud layers below. It impacted the ocean 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57 hours. 1 bomber eliminated, 11 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge indicated 15% consumed. 3 more contacts still appeared on Porter's scope, all advancing toward the airfields, all separated by miles of obsidian sky. Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Porter identified the second target at 00:14 hours, December 30th. Heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet, range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 southward and descended. The problem was geometric. The second bomber was 23 miles from the first kill location. Smith's P-61 cruised at 280 miles per hour, meaning approximately 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent flying closer to Mindoro, closer to the airstrips, closer to mission completion. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster, 320 miles per hour. The R-2800 engines devoured fuel at alarming rates at high-power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol endurance. But failing to intercept the bomber quickly meant it would reach the target area. American anti-aircraft gunners would engage. The bomber might be destroyed, or it might release its ordnance. Either outcome meant Smith failed. The mathematics of night interception were unforgiving. Most night fighter sorties ended without enemy contact. The sky was vast. Even with radar, locating a single bomber demanded perfect coordination between pilot and radar operator. Locating 4 bombers in one night approached impossibility. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills total since deploying to the Pacific Theater. 18 kills across 14 months. Smith already claimed 4 kills personally. Adding 4 more in one night would make him the top American night fighter ace of the entire war. But records were irrelevant. What mattered was stopping those bombers. Porter called corrections. Smith adjusted heading. The second contact strengthened on the radar scope. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired the bomber visually at 1 mile. Another Betty, identical profile, identical vulnerable fuel tanks. This bomber flew lower than the first, 6,000 feet instead of 8,000, closer to the cloud deck. That gave Smith reduced maneuvering room. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target. The approach had to be flawless. Too fast, and he'd overshoot. Too slow, and the bomber might detect him. Night fighters depended on surprise. Once the enemy knew you were there, everything changed. Bomber crews would take evasive action. Gunners would open fire. The clean intercept would devolve into a dogfight. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty distinctly, dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew maintained straight and level flight, no evasive maneuvers, no indication they knew Smith was there. The P-61's black paint rendered it nearly invisible nocturnally. The engines were quiet compared to most fighters. The Japanese called the P-61 the Black Widow. They feared it, but fear only worked if they knew it was hunting. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range 350 yards. He fired. 2-second burst. 48 rounds. The shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The starboard engine caught fire immediately. Then the port. Both wings burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove oceanward. Smith observed it fall. It struck the water at 00:19 hours, 17 minutes past midnight. 2 bombers down, 10 remaining. Smith's fuel gauge showed 42% remaining. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope. Both were closer to Mindoro than the previous targets. Both at different altitudes, one at 9,000 feet, one at 4,000 feet. They were 8 miles apart. Smith made a decision. He would take the higher target first. Climbing consumed less fuel than descending rapidly. But the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to advance closer to the airfields. If Smith made the wrong choice, one bomber would penetrate, and the entire mission would be judged a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 00:23 hours. Porter locked the third contact. Range 7 miles, heading 160, speed 190 knots. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Betty's, and it was taking evasive action, turning, changing altitude. Someone aboard that aircraft knew Americans had night fighters in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49, called Helen by Americans. Faster than the Betty, maximum speed 306 miles per hour. Better defensive armament, 5 7.7mm machine guns. The tail gunner commanded a clear field of fire directly aft. Approaching from dead astern would position Smith in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach vector. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and left, the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith exploited that weakness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, descending 300. The pilot was experienced, understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Porter compensated by predicting the bomber's movements, watching the pattern, anticipating the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's pilot executed a sharp turn to the right. Smith followed. The P-61's twin-boom configuration gave it excellent stability. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith kept the bomber centered in his gun sight. Range 500 yards, 450, 400. At 375 yards, the Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streamed past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive action. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst. 72 rounds. Longer than his previous attacks. Necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The starboard engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It struck the water at WW2 hours, 29 minutes after midnight. 3 bombers destroyed, 9 remaining. Smith's fuel gauge showed 28%, critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 30% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing or worse. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter had one more contact on his scope, the fourth target, heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfields, thin beams of white light sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the fourth bomber. Diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above, use gravity to increase his speed, reduce the time the target had to react. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile. Another, Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Mindoro. No evasive action. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area or didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill, below and behind 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter. 512 rounds remaining, enough for 3 more attacks, maybe 4 if he was conservative. But this was the 4th target. He needed to make every shot count. Smith's fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. One chance. One burst. Then he had to return to base whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying. Smith fired at 0034 hours, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The bomber's port wing separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. It impacted at 0035 hours, 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The mathematical calculation was simple. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gallons hourly at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 36 minutes, more than enough to reach the airfield, unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact. But Smith's night wasn't over. At 0042 hours, Porter detected a new contact heading north. Range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field. Fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfield Smith had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much fuel. Smith might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse. letting a Japanese bomber reach Mindoro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber got through and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died because Smith prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, called Frank by Americans. A single-engine fighter. Maximum speed 392 miles per hour. 4 12.7mm machine guns, 2 20mm cannons. One of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, better rate of climb. In daylight, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith had one advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know Smith was there. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit, and the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach McGuire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Future intercepts would be more difficult. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. The mathematics were clear. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15%, below minimum safety margin. But letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at 0045 hours. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds. The longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute open, a white canopy against black sky. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 0046 hours. Smith checked his fuel gauge, 15%. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large land mass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days, minimal lighting, no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gallons total. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time. Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, That meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel? Barely. At Orero 52 hours, Smith spotted the runway lights, 12 dim lamps arranged in a line. The runway was 5,000 feet long, crushed coral surface. Engineers had completed construction on December 26th, the same day the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations, but lacked the safety features of established airfields. No overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. At night, with minimal lighting, any landing error would likely be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, 57 gallons. The P-61 consumed fuel faster during landing approach. Power settings fluctuated. Engines spooled up during turns, spooled down during descents. Each power change consumed additional fuel. Smith calculated he had approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough to land unless something went wrong. At 00:55 hours, something went wrong. The runway lights went out, all 12 lamps extinguished simultaneously. Complete darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway, altitude 800 feet, airspeed 140 knots. Without runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. The P-61 would hit the ground before Smith realized how low he was flying. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter. The device measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface, accurate to within 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning navigation. When the altimeter showed 0 feet, he would be on the ground. The technique was dangerous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway, hitting trees or coral reefs or construction equipment. Smith's fuel gauge showed 9%, 46 gallons, 8 minutes of flight time. Not enough to divert to another airfield. Tacloban on Leyte was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. The P-61 would run out of fuel 40 miles short. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights, or crash into the ocean and hope someone rescued him before he drowned. The decision was simple: survive the landing or make the mission meaningless. Smith had survived 4 intercepts, 5 kills in 55 minutes, the highest single-night total for any American night fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. He had saved American lives on the ground, protected the airfields, enabled the Lingayen Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the entire mission meaningless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was located. His altitude was 600 feet, fuel at 9%. The darkness below was absolute. Smith descended to 400 feet. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. He reduced airspeed to 120 knots. The P-61 stall speed was 95 knots with flaps fully extended. Flying at 120 knots gave Smith a 25-knot safety margin. Not much, but descending slower would consume more fuel. The mathematics were unforgiving. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly. McGuire Field was inland, approximately 1 mile from the beach. Smith used compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading was 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle or construction areas, or coral reefs. At 00:58 hours, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear under each engine nacelle. Nose gear forward fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was robust, designed to handle rough airfields, but landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard, collapse the gear. The aircraft would cartwheel. At 120 knots, the crew would not survive. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes remaining. He extended flaps to full. The P-61's airspeed decreased to 110 knots. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet, 200, 150. Smith couldn't see the ground. No lights, no visual references, just instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. At 100 feet altitude, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. 75 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Smith prepared for touchdown. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral at 0059 hours. The impact was harder than normal. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly. 100 knots, 80, 60, 40. The aircraft slowed to taxi speed at 20 knots. Smith couldn't see where he was on the runway. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights, guided Smith to the parking area. The P-61's engines shut down at 0103 hours, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were stiff, his hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. Porter climbed out from the radar operator's compartment. He had tracked 5 targets successfully, vectored Smith to each intercept, maintained radar contact throughout the engagement. Without Porter's skill, none of the kills would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort, pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The ground crew inspected the P-61, no damage. All 4 cannons had functioned correctly. Total ammunition expended, 408 rounds. Smith had started the mission with 800 rounds. He landed with 392 rounds remaining. Enough ammunition for 2 more intercepts, but 0 fuel for pursuing additional targets. Intelligence officers arrived at 01115 hours. They wanted details, times, locations, altitudes, aircraft types. Smith provided the information from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki-49 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima Kai-84 Frank fighter. All destroyed between 23:57 on December 29th and 00:46 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light. 4 bombers, 1 fighter. All exactly where Smith reported. 4 kills in one night equaled the record for American night fighters. But Smith wasn't finished. On December 30th, 1944, at 14:30 hours, Smith flew his second mission of the day. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted over Mindoro. Single-engine fighters, faster than bombers, more difficult to intercept. Smith and Porter took off in the same P-61. The aircraft had been refueled and rearmed, 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 646 gallons of fuel. At 15:12 hours, Porter detected a contact heading north, altitude 12,000 feet, range 8 miles. Smith climbed to intercept. The target was another Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter, faster than the P-61 in level flight. But Smith had altitude advantage. he dove on the Frank from above. The diving attack increased his speed to 390 miles per hour, faster than the Frank's maximum level speed. Smith fired at 400 yards, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and dove into the ocean. Smith's 7th kill. The final victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II. 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Mindoro through January 1945. The unit scored 18 total kills during the war, the highest total of any P-61 squadron in the Pacific Theater. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of the squadron's total score. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. His skill made every intercept possible. The P-61 times. Awaston continued flying combat missions through May 1945. The aircraft survived the war undamaged. After VJ Day, it was scrapped along with most Black Widows. Only 4 P-61s exist today. None of them is Smith's aircraft. The nose art, the kill markings, the aircraft that hunted 4 bombers in 80 minutes, all lost to history. McGuire Field supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from Mindoro provided air cover. The airfield Smith defended on December 29th enabled that air cover. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs hitting the construction areas would have delayed airfield completion by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant the invasion would have been delayed. Casualties would have mounted. The war would have lasted longer. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives, unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed, and missions accomplished. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could achieve. 700 aircraft built, used in every theater: European, Pacific, China, Burma, India, Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61, continued service until 1954, then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with better performance. But in December 1944, over Mindoro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the best pilot flying it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're at WW2 Shadows, rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who saved lives with radar. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Major Carroll Smith doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.